Good afternoon, and welcome to Integrating Newly Acquired Physician Practices, a complimentary webinar from HealthSystemCIO.com. My name is Anthony Guerra. I'm the editor-in-chief of HealthSystemCIO.com, and I'll be your moderator today. To ask a question, you can type it into the lower right-hand corner of your screen at any time. Leave the default set to all panelists, and I'll be looking at those and posing them to our speaker later in the program, but we encourage you to send them in at any time. You can download the deck using the URL on your screen. I'll also send it out in the chat box in a few minutes. And it's at the shortened URL is at the bottom of each slide. And we are recording today's event, so we'll have an archive. It'll be ready within 2 business days, and you'll receive an email when it's ready, and a separate registration is required. Just so you see how we're going to spend our time today, we're going to go 40 to 45 minutes. First, we're going to hear from our good friend Neal Ganguly, VP and CIO at JFK Health System, and then we're going to have our Q&A with Neal. So without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Neal Ganguly. Neal, thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Anthony. It's my pleasure. When Anthony asked me actually to cover this topic a few months ago, I really thought we'd be much further along, and I'd have a great story to tell. And I think what I'm going to talk about more will be a work in progress or a community hospital's journey towards the acquisition and integration of physician practices. In terms of an agenda, I'll give you a little background on JFK and sort of our demographics, and then I'll cover a couple of topics primarily around goals and objectives and governance and why those are important to us and how we're doing it, kind of dealing with setting goals and governance. And I'll talk a little bit about logistics and some measurement concepts, and then really get into what probably are the lessons that we've learned to date and how we're trying to incorporate those on a go-forward basis. The picture you see on this slide is one that kind of resonates with me. It really represents our journey to date. You know, you can almost visualize the doctor on one side and the hospital on the other, and there's this tangled mess that we're dealing with in the middle as we try to unravel everybody's wants and needs through this process of creating this hospital-physician kind of collaborative. So by way of background, JFK is a community hospital, not-for-profit community hospital located in central New Jersey. Like many hospitals in the Northeast, we have a large voluntary medical staff. We're about 400 beds for the medical center, and then we have a 98-bed rehab institute. It's acute care rehab, 500 beds of long-term or subacute care, a neuroscience, neurosurgery institute, home care, hospice, EMS. So we offer a full range of services to the community. And of course, we have multi-specialty physician groups that we have had for some time and are now growing fairly aggressively. But it's a new world for us in terms of the rapid growth of these physician practices. In addition to all of that, we do have an accountable care organization. We have a Medicare ACO and a commercial ACO with our local Blue Cross plan, and have somewhere just under 20,000 covered lives on those 2 plans, and are a member of a large regional health information exchange, which covers the northern part of our state and includes about 30 hospitals, and have a number of residency programs. So fairly typical community hospital for the Northeast, and I think that, you know, what we'll talk about over the next 20, 30 minutes will resonate probably primarily with hospitals and health systems who are in that niche. Obviously, around the country, as there are other models of healthcare, your challenges may be somewhat different. Continuing on to give a little background, so I mentioned we have a primarily voluntary medical staff. We have about 945 physicians on staff altogether, but you can see that 733 of them are the traditional voluntary physicians. We look at our physicians in a sort of range of these 5 buckets. So we've got the traditional voluntary docs who have admitting privileges, and we have the contracted physicians who are part of groups that provide service to the hospital, such as our ER physicians and our radiologists. Then we have our employed practices. Today, JFK has got 5 practices with 85 physicians who are salaried by JFK, so we own and operate those practices. And then we have a managed or leased relationship with 8 other practices, which encompasses another 42 physicians. So we've got about 127 physicians kind of under our multi-specialty group at this point, and that's only about 13% of our overall medical staff, but it is rapidly growing. We do expect to grow that number by about 30 physicians this year, and it'll be a mix of employed and leased or managed practices. And a little later on, I'll touch on sort of one of the challenges that we all need to be keeping in mind as we go down integrating these practices, and that's what is the difference between how you're going to handle employed practices and leased practices. And a lot of that is an organizational decision, but one that, as the IT folks, we need to understand the mechanics of, because it can impact how you support these environments. I do have a final bucket down there, affiliated physicians. We don't have any physicians that we've kind of categorized in that bucket yet. But the idea there is for alternate arrangements like MSOs, where you're not managing the practice or employing the physician, but you're offering a set of services. That's something we're thinking about as an option, and so it's there just for the purpose of this presentation as another model that can be pursued. So as I move into kind of the meat of the presentation, I start with the concept of goals and objectives. And I think it's really important for us as IT professionals to understand very clearly the whys around the physician acquisitions and the models of acquisition. And I'll also say sometimes it's equally important to ensure that the organization has clearly defined the why. Oftentimes you'll find that many of our organizations are acquiring physician practices in a reactive mode, and that certainly can work, and it can certainly help to build a broad strategy for an organization. But if the whys aren't well defined, I think you're going to have challenges around alignment and eventually around meeting the goals that you want to see in terms of building a really robust physician hospital kind of integrated environment. So key questions: why is the hospital interested in acquiring the practices? Is it to build referral volume? Is it to be defensive against systems that are competing in their area? Why does the practice want to get acquired? Is it just the physician wanting to preserve their income stream or their staff and not have to worry about the business aspect of it? What kind of incentives can be put in place to ensure that the physician will remain at the same level of productivity as they were before they were acquired? Things like this are important for us to understand, because they will influence in some way our technology approach and our support approach. And as I mentioned before, the particular model that's being selected can often be very important as well. In our case, we have a number of physicians in both the employed and the managed model, but we're seeing a lot of physicians gravitate more towards the managed model, which is more of a lease arrangement in our scenarios. And we find that a challenge because oftentimes the physicians in that case are not as willing to relinquish some of their operational preferences. And so we have struggled to define clearly what the support parameters are for a managed or leased practice versus an employed practice. So I think that as we all go through this journey, it's one of the things that you have to bring up early on as your organization is evaluating the models for practice acquisition and make some hard decisions around how you're going to support those kind of things. And transparency obviously is key. I think that it's important for organizations to ensure that the physicians and the hospital have aligned goals. ensuring that alignment. I think technology can play a role in helping to measure and track all of that. And so with the hospital and physician group sitting together to understand what they both want to get out of this relationship, we can then structure technology around that to ensure that there's tracking towards that, people are held accountable towards that, et cetera. And of course, that ties right into the concept of governance. And really, strong governance is critical in terms of the success of a physician-hospital kind of partnership. In our case, the governance piece is something that I think we got going a little later than we'd like. In JFK, we started acquiring the practices, understanding that it was an important part of a broader strategy, but I don't know that we had early on established the right level of governance to deal with a lot of the logistical kind of issues and the business issues that might arise without having that structure in place. So one of the things you have to look at is, well, what's the role of governance in a process like this? And first and foremost, it's to ensure that there is a good representation of the involved parties. So it's got to include physician participants as well as folks in the hospital, but it has to be something that is manageable. And I think a lot of work should go into establishing a really representative governance model that the entire physician community of practices will have respect for and will be able to abide by the decisions that that group of physicians will help kind of disseminate or establish as participants in a governance process. So beyond establishing a well-balanced governance group, I think that group will help to define the visions and goals at a global level and ensure that as practices are acquired, that the hospital's goals and the physician's goals are well aligned, and will ensure that resources that need to be prioritized to either onboard these practices or to bring these practices up to a level of performance are going to be effectively prioritized against the visions and goals that are established. I think that this group also has to evaluate performance, and it has to hold people accountable to that performance so that we understand when we're slipping from our vision or our goals and can take the appropriate corrective action. IT, I think, has a real role in the governance process also, not as a voting member, but more as an educator and advisor. First, obviously, to evaluate and scope sort of the technical needs of this practice group or group of practices, however it's structured, and to bring opportunities to that governance group for using technology in ways that may streamline process or reduce cost. IT must be able to educate the governance group with respect to these options and what the potential returns and benefits are, and allow the governance group then to make decisions around key things like the enforcement of standards, either application standards or technology standards. And at JFK, in the interest of kind of how we're communicating today and sharing information, that's an area we're still working on. Many of our practices have different technology infrastructures, and we're still kind of learning our way through how to best go about establishing those standards and get value from a streamlined, truly standardized environment. So when you kind of go beyond the governance piece and you've established your vision, your goals, you've established the possibility of standards and some criteria around what the standards represent, you've got the logistical issues about how do you go in now and actually look at a practice and evaluate that practice and onboard that practice into the group infrastructure. And we've learned a lot through this process. In the early practices, we went in and did a very basic kind of evaluation on just hardware, asset inventory, things like that, and found that really kind of was biting us later on in the process when all of a sudden physicians were coming back with requests for lots of new either equipment or applications, et cetera. So it's critical to go in and look at the infrastructure, not so much with just an inventory type eye, but really understanding how well the infrastructure is currently able to meet the needs for the practice, how it compares against the standards that the organization is driving towards, and to look at that information and create some real budgetary data to feed back to the management process in terms of the practice acquisition group, so they understand, hey, there's going to be some costs here, either in equipment upgrades or application upgrades, interfaces, whatever it may be. I think giving this portion of the process short shrift will also give you a headache further down the path. I think it's important for the governance group also, I didn't mention this in the prior slide, but I think it's also important for the governance group to really help define very clearly what the support expectations will be for the different kinds of practices that you're managing. And primarily we're looking at it as, hey, how are we supporting employee practices versus the leased practices, or what we call the managed practices. And the employee practices, for our part, has been relatively straightforward. We're supporting them as we do kind of hospital departments, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But the leased practices have posed the great challenges because, notwithstanding the fact that they have different technology infrastructures, we're finding that they often have external service providers. They have preferences in terms of who they like to work with, and the physicians are often very prescriptive about what they'd like to see happen, and it's often things that we're not normally able to accommodate. And so we've seen our support costs creep above where we would expect them to be because of the demands that are being placed on us by some of these leased practices. So it's an important thing to try to understand early on, and to ensure that as the management team that is responsible for acquiring these practices, going out and negotiating these deals, that they're very clearly and explicitly spelling out what the support implications are for each of the different models they may be offering. Without that, I think the IT group is at risk for seeing their costs kind of climb in terms of support, and frankly, probably dealing with some dissatisfaction from the practices with respect to the support that they're offering. I talked about standards before, and I think that there are tremendous opportunities as you build a larger and larger group to realize some expense reductions and some process improvements through standardization, whether it be on the equipment side or services or applications. But I think that there is also quite a political line that has to be drawn in terms of dealing with, as I mentioned in the prior slide, these physician preferences that may be out there. But in our case at JFK, we are initially focusing on standardizing equipment infrastructure, but not right out of the gate. So we're doing our evaluation. If the equipment meets the basic specifications that we've got for our infrastructure, then we're tagging what the end of life should be for that equipment, and then our plan is when that equipment is due to be replaced, it would be replaced with equipment that falls under our standard to allow us to have an easier support profile. Same thing with our telecommunications infrastructure. You know, we're moving everybody onto common contract, and I think we're enjoying some savings there. by having a sort of a larger group purchasing kind of environment. But we haven't done anything on the EMR and practice management system side yet. Well, we haven't done anything on the EMR side. We have been moving all of the practices onto a standard practice management system so that the scheduling and billing is being handled in a standardized fashion. And our goal is to begin to move everybody to a standard EMR over time as well, but we haven't been able to get any real agreement as to a timeline for that kind of movement. So measurement, as with any initiative that's IT related, I think it's important for us to ensure that there is an evaluation on the success. IT is a facilitator for most of our business units, and I think the practices are no exception to that. So part of the governance structure has got to be a focus on defining the performance elements that are going to be measured, and as we roll out the technologies in these areas, we have to focus on ensuring that the technologies are being deployed in a way that will capture the necessary information, that will allow it to be reported out effectively to the accountable parties, whether that be the physician or practice managers, or whether that be the finance folks or quality folks back at the hospital who are looking at that. So those tools are critical, and without a really standardized environment, it can actually become quite an interesting challenge. The interfaces needed to get the data out of some of the legacy systems, all of those things can add to the cost and complexity of that part of the exercise, but there's something that should be, measurement is something that should be considered, and I think can be used as an argument, if you will, for trying to drive the standardization, because if done properly, you can avoid some of the costs of interfacing and data extraction that would otherwise be faced. And as with any measures, you need to establish clear baselines and desired goals or targets so that people can be held accountable to reaching those, and if they're not reached, that mitigation plans can be put forward to understand what happened and how can we correct whatever happened in order to attain those goals. And I think all of us maintain a continuous improvement sort of mindset, but that's obviously the reason why we would push for a measurement infrastructure to ensure that the data is being used to continually improve the operation of the practice environment. And as part of the governance structure, they need to ensure that they're evolving the goals and objectives to be consistent with the changing landscape in healthcare, particularly as we're driving away from the fee-for-service and towards pay-for-performance. We're seeing, all of us are seeing the need for that information to really effectively reflect the quality of the services being rendered, and at the same time, we need the data to ensure that we're rendering those services at the lowest possible cost basis. So, the last few slides, what I covered was sort of a very high-level internal instruction set that we had into how we were going to approach the practice acquisition challenge at JFK. It's sort of textbook in a way. I talked a little bit about some of the real-world challenges we faced, but there were a lot of challenges, and there still remain a lot of challenges. We kind of, I kind of coined this term the 5 Ps, and for me, the 5 Ps are preference, personality, practice, priorities, and politics. And I think those sum up a lot of the challenges that we face in dealing with the physicians who are originally voluntary physicians, independent members of our medical staff, who are now facing a different reality and looking for some sort of cover, either a way out or a way to preserve themselves in their way of life in the face of a lot of change. And so I won't necessarily run through all of these, but from a preference standpoint, some of the things we face are challenges like, hey, we're not going to call the hospital help desk. We have our own resources. Or we prefer to use vendor A and we're not going to use the hospital's vendor B no matter what. Most of the practices really wanted all new equipment. Even after we went in and we evaluated the sufficiency of their equipment, they said now that we're owned and operated by the hospital, we want everything to be new. So as you're dealing with sort of those user preferences that are being driven to you, having that strong criteria established by the governance group has got to be your fallback to say, hey, listen, this is what the governance group has agreed to in terms of a standard, and this is what's going to be deployed. And as we evaluate what those practices have in there, it's important to have the physicians really sign off on understanding that, hey, their equipment still has useful life, or their applications still have functional life, and make sure that those expectations are very clearly spelled out so that there's no room, if you will, for that scope creep that can come in. Personality is another thing. I think most of us who deal with physicians know they have strong personalities. From I refuse to use an EMR and you can't make me, which is literally a quote from a physician directly. So the next one, your technology stinks and it's killing my patients. So how do we deal with those kind of strong personalities who tend to then take those messages back to the rest of their colleagues and often make our support role very difficult? And again, I kind of point back to governance as the key way to deal with those kind of folks. And we've worked to not quite script, but at least educate our support staff in terms of how to interact with these providers. But I'll talk a little bit about support in the next slide, I think. But it's interesting for us because the practices require support that is really not necessarily the same kind of model as hospital departments require support. And it's something that we have to really evaluate and figure out how to handle properly. In terms of just the other keys, if you will, we've always done the work this way. We're not going to change now. You're changing our practice, making us less efficient. How come my office is being converted after my colleague? You know who I am. One of my favorites is all the board members are my patients. So we've dealt with everything from sort of the passive-aggressive threats to the pleading for resources, and I think that is really a byproduct of the fact that as we got into this early on, we didn't have those expectations very clearly defined. Everybody assumed that, well, the IT stuff is fine, we'll take a look at what they've got, and if it looks okay, we're fine, we'll just deal with that and move on. And it ends up being an area that can add a lot of cost to the hospital in terms of the acquisition. And so it's very important for the group who's managing these acquisitions to understand what those costs are and how to effectively deal with them. So some lessons learned from our journey thus far. As I said before, ambulatory practices have needs that are really different from hospital departments. We've got to tailor a support environment to really meet those needs. But within reason, and one of the challenges we've got is obviously if a printer is down in a back office area in the hospital, it's a different kind of an issue compared to a printer being down in a practice somewhere. And so we've had to at least educate our help desk staff and our field support staff as to what the urgency and priority levels should be for dealing with those kind of challenges at the practice level. The response times they need are often a little bit more acute because they may have patients just standing there and waiting for service, and they're unable to deliver that service to them effectively with down equipment or down applications. So one of the things that I think I have a bullet item on this later, but we've got to look at whether or not it makes sense to support the practices using the hospital help desk and field support resources. Other lessons we learned, the hospital physician goal alignment is critical. A lot of the physicians went into this thinking, hey, this is just a way for me to preserve my income, and the hospital is obviously looking for different things like to preserve their referral patterns, et cetera. But if those aren't clearly spelled out, the doctors are very happy to kind of look at the hospital as an open ATM and say, well, can you come and redo my office and redo my technology and everything. And one of the things we had to push back to the doctors is this philosophy of, well, doctor, if you were still an independent practice, would you make this investment? To force that kind of thinking, I think, is critical, whether it's from a business standpoint or a technology standpoint. Standards must be agreed to at the governance level. We're still struggling with that, but we're seeing at least the acceptance of the concept, but not necessarily yet success in implementing that in practice. Politics, also personality challenges. You know, physicians are famous, especially surgeons and folks who are in very acute settings. They have a very short fuse sometimes, and we've got to make sure that there is governance to deal with that. And that's no different necessarily from how we deal with them in the hospital, but because we are now interacting often in their office, there's a slightly different perception in terms of the ownership and the accountability and the rights that they have, if you will. As I mentioned before, evaluating the practice infrastructure is something you've got to do very carefully. You've got to really understand where the management team's and the governance group's vision is for taking these practices over the short term and evaluate the infrastructure against that to say, well, okay, this asset we're acquiring or that we're going to be operating is going to have this much useful life towards that vision. And at some point, to identify what the costs are to take it to the next level. Communication is critical. I think that one of the things we still struggle with in bringing a lot of different practices together is that it's still kind of a hub and spoke, that there's a lot of communication between the management team that's overseeing the acquisitions and each practice, but there isn't as much communication among the practices in terms of particularly procedures and how to handle sort of operational changes now that they're under the hospital umbrella. And so that and around goals and vision, I think it's important for that communication to be very clear, particularly as this bullet item talks about around, from an IT perspective, technical support. Who's entitled what kind of support and when, and how do we support applications as an IT team that we may never have seen before, or how do we act as a clearinghouse for the support if it's appropriate, so that we can track it, yet we can make sure that the hospital or the physician's office vendor is still on the hook for that support. And these are some of the challenges that we're dealing with because of the range of EMRs that we're still supporting in the current environment. Standardization, we talked about that earlier. I think that we're still driving towards that. We believe it's important. We believe the measurements of success have to be stronger. Right now, they're primarily financial indicators, and what we're looking for now is trying to get more quality indicators, trying to get more throughput indicators, so that there is a good snapshot of the health of that practice and what it's doing towards, or what it's contributing towards the greater good of the hospital and practice sort of partnership. This bullet item says, don't underestimate the resource requirements around support, and give serious thought to the possibility of outsourcing support for the practices. It is a very different model. Requires a lot of time on the road, and unless you're already operating an environment with multiple facilities, you're probably spending less time. There's possibly needing vehicles and needing additional staff. And what are those metrics that should be in place if you decide to continue to support it in-house? How many additional providers should trigger an additional resource or staff member, et cetera? And of course, as I said, communication is critical. You've got to communicate early and often, not just about the goals and objectives of the acquisition, but of the IT support, logistics, the policies, procedures. This ends up being actually quite a challenging conversion for many of these practices. In our case, in the Northeast, most of the groups are actually small groups of 1 to 4 or 5 physicians, considered a larger group. And so they often don't have internal IT support. They'll have a practice manager who wears many hats. And to kind of get those people all in line now with operating under the hospital umbrella of the HIPAA rules that obviously they were accountable to as well, but now we've got a much more rigid process for those kind of things. The forms that have to be signed for them to get access to email, and the fact that now they can't use their Gmail account to communicate with their colleagues or the physicians, they've got to use secure email or secure texting. All of these kind of resources that have to be dealt with are things that really need to be explained to these physicians up front. Otherwise, you end up with an environment where there is some pretty significant dissatisfaction on their part because they've formed their own expectations and you'll never meet them successfully. And then you have to ensure that IT is at the table from the planning stages so that these issues can be put on the table, the management team understands them clearly, and will not necessarily take some of the issues that come from the physician side as failures of IT, because they were prepared to understand that there will be support implications or there will be costs that they have to be aware of. So with IT at the table early on and those kind of expectations being communicated effectively to governance and management groups, I think it really does lend itself towards the best chance of success in bringing these practices on successfully. So that's my presentation. Certainly I'm happy to take questions. Anthony, I don't know if I turn it over to you.
Yep. Excellent presentation, Neal. We really appreciate it. We have a couple of questions that have already come in. So let's get started. And I think you kind of touched on this, Neal, about the EHR situation. Obviously, that's a hot topic with folks out there. I don't know how much you want to discuss your particular situation and what you have going on over there, but what are your high-level thoughts around, obviously the hospital will have one EMR and your own practices, you can get those on, but when you acquire a practice, looking at what they have, deciding if you're, and I've been talking to CIOs about this for years now, deciding if you're going to get everyone on one, if you're going to say maybe here are our 3 preferred, or some kind of HIE hub and spoke where you take anybody on and just plug them into your HIE. But what are your thoughts around that?
Well, I definitely think that any of those models are possible. My preference is to drive everybody to a single EMR. We looked at the multiple EMR option, and I think the costs are still higher there, and no matter what, we're not meeting the preference needs broadly enough of the physicians to customize and select their own EMR. So giving them 3 options doesn't necessarily make your life any easier as a CIO. So my preference, and I think the direction we're heavily pushing, is a standardized EMR platform where possible. And I think obviously we have to be open to the fact that there are going to be times when you just can't accommodate the needs of a particular specialty like oncology, et cetera, on what might be your primarily selected platform. But that's the goal we're going to take. We are members of an HIE, and we have been leveraging that, but that's still not necessarily resolving some of our issues in terms of sharing data effectively between the practices and the hospital.
Very good. And this is a related question. When you acquire a practice that has met meaningful use and they're highly functional on their EMR and they want to keep it, but again, I suppose that's all part of the getting things to be on getting everyone on the same page before you walk down the aisle together.
Yeah, we do have a couple of practices that have attained meaningful use, and so we are supporting them down that meaningful use journey using outside resources. So we're not using the staff that's doing the hospital MU work is not supporting the physicians as well. We've had to bring an outside organization in to help support that, just from a resource perspective. And we're not moving those physicians off of their EMR right now. This is a planned direction for us to move to a standard EMR. So right now we don't have that. So if they've attained MU on their existing EMR, we're continuing to support that.
Okay, very good. How did JFK approach the risk that legacy systems holding ePHI were at unsecured locations, or that acquired practices may not have security policies and not be HIPAA compliant?
That's actually a great question, and we've identified it from the IT perspective as a significant risk and have allocated in our budgeting process for each of these practices monies for firewalls to be put in, training to be done in terms of security. We have not done, we've done internal audits of the practices as part of the onboarding process, but we haven't really brought third-party audits in yet to validate that we're fully protecting that. We're recommending that, though, and a lot of that becomes a business decision as to whether the business feels like it's worth making that kind of investment. But it's an open area of risk. These practices clearly aren't always operating with the state of the art in terms of security, and I think a lot of times all of us in the industry are just praying that they're too small as targets to be that attractive to the hackers, but I wish I had a better answer for that.
Okay. It's a good answer, so don't worry about it. When you acquire a practice and are consolidating them onto your main EHR, what is your process for data conversion? Any thoughts there?
Well, we haven't actually brought any of the practices onto the main EHR yet. So that's I didn't tell the full story of where JFK is going with its EHR right now, but we're the hospital system, legacy system, is one that's being sunset, so we're in the process of selecting a replacement for that. So the goal downstream is in the next 2 years to have a new hospital system and have that same vendor supplying the ambulatory system and leverage integration through that method. What we're doing right now in terms of sharing information between the practices, obviously they're looking for their lab data and transcribe reports and all of that. We're using our HIE connection to supply all of that information.
Okay, great. Talk about bandwidth requirements. So what are the discussions like between you and the rest of your C-suite in terms of getting an agreement or an understanding that, hey, we're acquiring practices, that means I have more customers to support, very intensive support, especially during the initial integration with the practice or onboarding. Have you talk about those conversations and just getting the rest of your C-suite to understand what you need as a department in order to support these practices?
Well, I think that factors into the ongoing challenges we have as IT departments in competing with resources. The C-suite has understood that bringing these practices on will increase the support load. They've encouraged looking at the possibility of outsourcing support for the practices, and we are evaluating that, but we have not necessarily come to the conclusion that that is a economically or customer service-wise a better way to go yet. we are trying to put some metrics together around what we believe the ratios are. So, one new field support person for every 10 physicians is sort of a loose number we've been playing with, but we haven't really gotten a good industry data yet, or identified good industry data to say, hey, we've got some evidence that supports that. And the same thing on the back end with integration personnel. The more practices we're bringing on, the more load we're placing on those folks. And there is acknowledgement of it, but there isn't yet an open checkbook, if you will, to say, hey, well, here's 5 more resources. So initially, they're trying to get us to do as much as we can with what we've got, and I think we'll have to continue to fight the battle and make a really effective business case as we move forward and track our activity effectively to show that we've increased our activity levels by X%, and that's just beyond the threshold we can support.
Very good. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting process, and it's almost as if you wind up getting into a new business of, field support, which you mentioned, and there's a whole host of issues there when you're running that kind of a business that people, maybe CIOs, find they're getting an understanding of as they get into this new dynamic. So again, I appreciate your presentation, and I think that's where we're going to have to leave it due to time today. I want to thank our friend Neal Ganguly, who really is our friend in New Jersey here, so much for participating. I know you're a busy man, but I think this was valuable to a lot of folks. So again, thank you for participating. For those who have attended, you'll receive an email when our archive is ready, and a separate registration is required. If you have the CHIME CHIO certification, let CHIME know you attended today, and you get 1 CEU. If you've asked us to let them know, we'll do that. Questions, comments, you can email me and go to our website to see our upcoming schedule and our last 12 months of archived events. So with that, I again want to thank Neal and all our attendees, and everybody have a wonderful day.